Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. I think we can start. I'm sorry we were running a little bit late, but thank you so much for having the energy to stay with us. I know this is the last session of today, so thank you so much. So I would like to start by setting the stage of this session, Rethinking Financial Inclusion Impact Measurement Collectively. With multiple crises coming on top of the global agenda, the financial inclusion community needs to better understand how, when, and for whom financial services bring well-being gains that actually translate into broader development outcomes. And here I'm referring to enabling adaptation to and mitigation of climate change, greater women economic empowerment, improving stability, productivity, and stronger growth among MSME, just to mention a few. The financial inclusion community has made important advancements in the right direction during the last couple of years. However, we are here today to have this conversation because CGAP, among a lot of our partner organizations, we believe that there is a renewed momentum in the financial inclusion community to deeply focus on outcomes. Recent advancements in data, methods, and technologies are now enabling us to better deal with and understand complexity. So today I'll start by walking you through a short deck which explains CGAP's rationale for embarking on what we call the Financial Inclusion 2.0 initiative. This initiative aims to help the industry better understand and measure the impact of financial inclusion. We see financial inclusion 1.0 as a drive to maximize access, and this initiative aims to go further. So we want to drive the industry to maximize, in an intentional manner, positive impacts on clients. And to guide us in exploring this topic, I'm honored to have with me Scott Graham, who is Vice President for Research and Data Science at FinCA International, and Tim Ogden, Managing Director for Financial Access Initiative from New York University. So after my short presentation, we'll dive into a rapid-fire Q&A with them. And this will be followed by an open discussion with all of you. This session is really meant to be interactive. So we want to hear what your questions are, what your reactions, suggestions, concerns. We want to have a discussion, okay? So don't feel shy to stop me if there's something that's unclear or ask any follow-up questions. Let's make it a little bit more dynamic. Okay. So this is going to be a visual presentation. So this is a storytelling deck. Despite the need to demonstrate the impact of development interventions, there's a lack of consistent evidence around which outcomes are most important to aspire to and to measure. The financial inclusion sector still relies heavily on access and usage as proxies for outcomes. These measures have served the world well, and it had helped focus on addressing foundational barriers to financial inclusion. However, simply ensuring that financial access and usage is not adequate in today's world. Not only do more people need to have access and use financial accounts, what we are referring to on this slide as the depth of financial inclusion, they need access to a suite of responsible products and services, what you see as the depth of financial inclusion. This suite of products and services then must enable individuals to meet those needs, such as generating income, accessing essential services, green solutions, addressing shocks, building resilience, what we refer to as the utility of financial inclusion. This is where our focus on outcomes must be directed. For example, to adapt to climate change, access to an account is helpful to access remittances or cash transfers, but it's not enough. Access to more financial services such as savings, loans, and insurance is helpful too, but it's not enough if these are not designed to meet the adaptation needs of the poor. And we know from our research that this is barely ever the case today. So we need to design financial products and interventions with outcomes in mind, such as to facilitate the climate adaptation of the poor. Now, there are multiple concepts and frameworks that are trying to capture the impact of financial inclusion better. You probably heard during the last few days concepts of financial health, financial well-being, which captures important elements of resilience of individuals and MSMEs. Financial health is a necessary condition and for many longer term outcomes, but in itself, it's not sufficient conditions for such outcomes. There is a need for more nuanced and more ambitious perspectives to understand how we can capture those changes that individuals and MSME experience and benefit from, both short-term and long-term. And also the higher level changes that they're experiencing at the collective level. So here I'm talking about society, communities. Okay. So the need for better outcome measures generally resonates with everyone in our industry. Yet we don't have sufficient outcome indicators to guide the industry. Despite demand for such indicators, few stakeholders are collecting and using them. We have at CGAP looked at over 1,600 financial inclusion indicators sampled from 32 organizations. And they're representing sector-wide national global surveys, foundations, funders, IPA research organizations. We looked at a lot of them. And of these 600 indicators, 200 of them, so 8%, are focused on what we call utility. But most of them are focusing on financial health and short-term resilience. And out of those 200 indicators, only 19 of them, it's barely 1%, focus on outcomes other than financial health and short-term resilience, such as well-being, agency, capturing opportunities. So overall, although the global indicators from the GPFI, G20, the Global Findex, they now have perspectives on short-term financial resilience, they're almost only focusing on access and usage. So actionable evidence of utility is needed, but it comes with challenges. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of them during the last few days. So let me try to mention a few of these roadblocks we have. Evidence shows that financial inclusion's contribution to development outcomes is complex. What works in one set of circumstances may not work or may actually do harm in another. There are technical limitations, including challenges in attributing impact and measuring longer-term effects, including even cross-generational. Defining robust measures of outcomes is difficult in surveys because it's often subjective and it's influenced by other factors. Measuring outcomes is costly and difficult, and some stakeholders, especially smaller inclusive finance players, they lack the incentives or the data or the capacity. And finally, the methods that have been used, and here we've talked mostly about the randomized controlled trials, they have left us with evidence that is fragmented and insufficiently actionable for decision-making. We have a lot of RCTs, but they do not tell us why financial inclusion interventions work in some cases and not in others, and how we can course correct. So to illustrate this, although there is no lack of studies on the impact of microcredit, the evidence is confusing and it's not actionable enough. A CGAP review, we looked at the global evidence, and they suggest that microcredits is particularly have a wide variety of impact from positive to negative. And here again, the dominant RCT studies that do not explain when, how, and for whom microcredit can provide benefits. So they're kind of limited in their relevance for actionable policymaking. So we lack a framework to interpret this evidence and build on more accurate, granular narrative of what microcredit can do for people. And this matters because there's persistently bad press around microcredit that keeps casting doubts about the benefits of the overall microfinance sector. And this can lead to unintended consequences, such as we've seen in Cambodia and other industries. Okay. So the Financial Inclusion 2.0 initiative aims to tackle these industry-wide challenges and guide the industry towards interventions with greater effectiveness. So we aim to do three bigger things. So we are mapping the impact evidence that, based on existing evidence, leads to the use of inclusive financial services to positive outcomes. And we also want to create decision-making tools for stakeholders across the financial inclusion industry to actually act on that evidence. We want to explore new multi-method approaches to evaluate the evidence of how and in what circumstances financial services can contribute to outcomes, including longer-term benefits for people and enterprises. And finally, we want to identify a set of evidence-based outcome indicators for the financial inclusion industry that will serve as guideposts for the industry. So to recap my opening statement, fast development in data, methods, and technology, including in machine learning and AI, will make this possible. We think that the time is ripe. And there are two key trends that we think is making this possible. So there's increased momentum within the financial service providers, investors, funders, policymakers to really focus beyond access. And then there are significant technological advancements, especially around digital technologies. And this is, again, machine learning AI, for example, that enables us to collect more data on customer outcomes and to analyze this more easily. So it's time to, we heard also Cecile say this earlier, but it's time to break the data silos, merge data and capabilities, and compile on previous experiences to build on past efforts. But to capture this potential, we need enhanced collaboration. So let me turn to these two nice gentlemen, and I'll come sit with you, and we can do a quick fire chat conversation. And I have 3 questions, and we'll do them one by one, and I'll ask you each one at a time. So the first one is for you, Scott. Based on your experience, what is driving the renewed interest in tackling knowledge gaps on how financial inclusion enables development outcomes?
Yeah, thank you. That was a great setup to the conversation, by the way. Yeah, so I think that the mandate for detailed customer profiling and outcomes is certainly not new, but I think it's gathering force in part because, you know, in the realm of research, of course, this has always been our currency in trade. So we've never not been interested in these things. But I think throughout the rest of the organization, you know, more and more people, just because of the moment we're living, are, you know, very hyper aware of the ways that companies are using data to create very personalized, very intimate experiences, and that the companies and organizations that are most successful are the ones that know us better than we know ourselves, actually. And so I think it's very natural to, just since we experience that ourselves, to then translate that mindset into our work and say, okay, well, how can we take that same approach and apply it towards developmental outcomes, especially, I think, with the recognition that I think really came to the front in the last couple of years around the importance of behavior and customer behavior and the way, you know, as a determining factor for outcomes. And so thinking about how we can use data to actually nudge people along different pathways of action. And so I think as this kind of more behavioral mindset has taken root, and as people throughout the organization have become more aware as consumers of how data is valuable to them, I think we're just kind of now trying to project that into our work as well.
Thank you. Tim?
You know, I would confess to being fairly cynical about this right from the get-go. And I mean, I think the bottom line is there is demand because there's more demand for the funds that have been flowed into microfinance. There are a lot more alternatives for social investors than there were 20 years ago. And particularly related to climate, you know, the people sort of raising their hands for climate funds don't have 20 years of RCTs showing relatively neutral impact of a bunch of so they can still do the things that microfinance was doing 20 years ago and say, look at this lovely household that we invested in and how great they're doing. And they don't have to sort of contend with some of the evidence. Now, a slightly less cynical view is this is a natural outgrowth of success, right? As you pointed out on that first slide, when we started this whole movement, the modern microfinance movement, there was not a lot out there. And we've made incredible success in the number of people who have access to a reasonably regulated, reasonably safe, reasonably non-predatory set of financial services than, say, in 1980. Mm-hmm. And now that we've done that, there is also a question, okay, where do we go from here? And how do we measure forward progress when it isn't just about who has access, creating sustainable financial institutions who have an interest in serving low-income populations, rural populations, marginalized populations, women, and those sorts of people.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We'll jump to the next question and then we'll return to the conversation with the audience. So what tools, data, and methods developed in recent years makes addressing the complexity of knowledge gaps in financial inclusion viable now?
Just- Yeah, so I mean, technology is transforming the world of research in very powerful ways. I mean, there's so many things to talk about, maybe just to cite a couple of the sort of things that people may or may not be familiar with. I mean, one thing which, I mean, this is not going to get any headlines, but I think it is really important in terms of the way that data is consumed and used by decision makers is improvements in the way that we visualize and present our data. So, you know, software like, you know, Power BI, Tableau, that have become kind of much more our currency in communicating data, which is really breaking out of the static mold of reporting that I think as researchers we're very habituated to. You know, we write up tables and graphs and write a lot of narrative, and then somebody's got to sit and read our thing for 10 minutes. Well, we don't have 10 minutes of anybody's attention anymore. So if we can't get our point across in 30 seconds, then somebody's already moved on to the next thing. So using technology as simple as data visualization to actually put those results directly in the hands of the users, and particularly when you're dealing with descriptive data that doesn't need a researcher perched on your shoulder interpreting it for you, so that people can really take ownership and act on it, and then they want more of it. And so I think that's, I mean, again, like I say, it's not going to get a headline, but just using technology to present data in a more dynamic and accessible way. And of course, there are many other things. I mean, the whole you know, shift to cloud computing is just an absolute game changer, because it brings so many tools in terms of the way we manage and store our data and the things we can do with it. And so being able to, you know, it's infinitely scalable, and we can scale it down if we're not using it because it's on a utility basis. So I think that that makes it accessible to large and small organizations. And then within that, I'll just mention one or two more. Data lakes, for example, you know, that's kind of a relatively new tool in cloud computing, but basically it breaks us out of the mindset, this very geometric idea we have of databases, you know, with their columns and their rows and the time series that really box us into a certain way of looking at the world. You know, a data lake says, you know, anything that's relevant to this topic you can bring into, you know, your analytical environment. And so, for example, we were doing our social impact reporting this year. We used a data lake. We put our survey data there. We put MIS data there. We put World Bank data there. We tapped into national statistical agencies. So we're able to actually create a context for our data to be presented, which allows people to then understand it and take meaning from it. So I think these kinds of tools, and I mean, I won't even mention, I mean, we could have a whole workshop just about AI and what that's bringing to it. But I think these kinds of tools, and again, because this is all provided on a cloud basis, you know, you pay for what you use, and when you're not using it, so it's no longer a cost. And a cost is no longer the barrier. It's more like whether we can adopt these tools and put them to use.
Thank you. Tim?
So I'll start off, Karina, by disagreeing a bit with something that you said in the earlier presentation. It's just to say that I think the research that we have on impact actually isn't contradictory. I think it actually is pretty clear and pretty uniform in saying the average impact of microcredit in general is not large. But there are people in each of those segments, in each of those studies, if you segment them out, you can find there are people who benefit greatly. And in general, there are very, very few people who are harmed. And so, you know, I think that is an important thing to continue returning to. The big question is, can we determine ex ante who those people who will really benefit are? Now, I do want to caution, like, I think that is possible because some of the tools like Scott is talking about, but I also want to caution to say, as an industry, we can't go that direction because you can't serve it's economically impossible to create institutions that only serve the winners, right? There aren't enough of them. And so to be able to serve the winners, you have to serve all of the neutrals too, to cover all of your costs of actually delivering these services. So, anytime I talk about this, I want to be clear that a huge a gain of the whole industry was the creation of workable financial services institutions in these environments. That's a new thing that I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for. Now, as Scott was saying, though, now we've got all these institutions that have an incredible amount of data that didn't have the opportunity to do granular level things with that data, that now it's becoming a lot more possible to do that. It's hard. It takes a lot of expertise. It takes a lot of really, really expensive expertise in terms of the human resources related to it. That the servers and the software is, that used to be the thing we used to worry about, right? The cost of that. We're transitioning to an area where that's cheap. It's the people who understand how to use it that are really expensive and hard to. So again, not a end all be all, but when we put those two things together and we have the ability to understand a bit more about who are the winners, who are the beneficiaries, with tools that don't rely on us designing an experiment that runs for 3 years and then trying to guess what the outcomes are in the first place. I think there's a lot of potential, as long as we don't think, oh, the end goal is let's find the 10 out of 1,000 winners and just serve those people.
I would actually love to build on something Tim said, because, and I meant to say this at the beginning. I mean, I think I understand why this conversation is framed in terms of outcomes, because it's a very natural way of thinking. But I think given this kind of more data-oriented approach, we can't really separate the outcomes from the people that those outcomes are intended for. So we can't really get to a what without starting with a who. And I think that having much richer customer profiles, so that it isn't just binary like winners and losers, but people might be winners and losers at different times of the day, or different, as they go through the course of their, economic life, and how we can really start to get this very granular picture of customers. I mean, just think about, we talk about reaching the unbanked. Well, the unbanked is hundreds of millions of people. What is the right number of indicators for, well-being outcomes? I mean, there has to be, millions of indicators, not even hundreds, right? So how we can sort of have, now that we can embrace that complexity, because we have the technology to do so, we could be much more targeted in understanding who we're reaching and what their particular outcome journey is going to be.
Thank you. So let's go to the last question, and afterwards we'll open up. So what do we have, what do we as an industry need to do together to help shift our collective gaze to outcomes? And can you give us a concrete example? You want to swap it up? Okay.
Yeah, not pick on Scott. Give Scott a chance to think about this one first. So I do struggle a bit with it collectively.
Okay.
And it comes back to something that Scott said is, individuals are not the poor are not a monolith. They have different goals. They have different possibilities. They're in different environments. And so, I don't think anybody here would argue that the poor need one thing. It depends on who they are, what context they're in. As an industry, I think, we can give ourselves the benefit of that reality too. And, I think about it as frameworks on how we overall think about the point of financial services, the point of a financial system. And I think we can sort of coalesce around some core ideas that go around different services, different models. And one way to think about it is the vaccine model versus the antibiotic model, right? In a vaccine model, right, it matters to get everybody the vaccine, because vaccines only work if everybody has access, and you're not really worried about how likely is this individual to get that disease. It's just make sure that everybody has the vaccine. That's a very valid way of thinking about financial services. Everybody should have the vaccine of access to safe, affordable services. But it's also potentially valid to think about this as a antibacterial. who has the disease and make sure that they get treated with something that's highly targeted to treat that disease.
Mhm.
It's in fact counterproductive to give that antibacterial to someone who doesn't have the problem. And so, I think those two things can work together. And I think there should be some institutions who are thinking, we're vaccinators. We're out there vaccinating people against the worst outcomes to make sure that everybody has access. And there should be institutions that we're the antibacterials. We're finding the people in the worst situations, or alternatively, the people with the best chance to grow that business 10x and make sure that they have exactly the drug that they need for their case.
Mhm. Scott?
Yeah. Well, so I agree also that the collectively sort of has an asterisk at the at the end of it, but I still think there's a lot of room for collaboration. Of course, I think that's always kind of goes without saying. But I would also say that, and just speaking from Finca's perspective here, that for us, one thing that's been very fruitful is kind of like going outside of our normal domain of collaborations.
Mhm.
And so having much more, we've spent most of the last year in a very deep engagement with Amazon Web Services, for example, not the typical partner that you would look for on an MFI's website. And, they're actually making the effort on their side. They've set up a whole nonprofit practice. They have it staffed with people from the Gates Foundation. I mean, so there are professionals on that side of the divide that are really kind of trying to figure out how they can move into this space. Of course, they have their own motivations for doing so. We don't need to be naive about that. However, the potential for good is there, and the resources and the know-how, it is just staggering what is happening in terms of the new data management tools and AI solutions, and it's just moving at lightning speed. I mean, I think I'm worried that in 10 years, if we're not all, riding that wave, we're just going to be, like a relic. This will all be considered very quaint and old timey, because the advance of AI into the whole realm of just human behavior is, unstoppable, and it's accelerating. So we better be part of the conversation to make sure that, at least to the extent it can be leveraged towards socially good aims, that it is. And so for us, partnering with AWS has meant, getting up the curve much faster than we would have in terms of things like, how we use data lakes, how we're using AI, but also educating them about our particular use cases and the customers that we're serving. So I think that just kind of getting out of our normal lane and starting to kind of tap into that kind of expertise is something that will really really be to our benefit. And in fact, I think it's more of like a must, because otherwise we will not be here in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. So thank you, both of you. I would like to open it up now to any questions, comments, suggestions, reactions. Yeah, we have a few hands over here. And please introduce yourself.
Okay, so good afternoon to everyone. My name is Davide Castellani. I'm professor of banking and finance at the University of Bergamo in Italy. I have a couple of points. So the first one is that, I mean, the embedded into a success of FSP, there is also the impact that the FSP is actually generating to the local population. Because, I mean, as long as financial services are valuable for the population, and so the population perceive that they are having an impact, then they will continue using the financial services. And so the success and the long-term sustainability of the FSP embedded, there is an impact. Okay, it's not visible, but it's there, because the crisis we have been assisting over time, they show that, when you are not generating an impact, at the very end, you will not be sustainable as a financial institution. Another point I want to make is that as we move from, so because you mentioned the importance of digital data, digital information, and I do believe that in the future, for example, we'll move from a collateral-based lending to a database lending that will also embed into that, will also show the impact, and because we will be able to track, for example, the revenues of informal SMEs, right? Because they will be digitalized even if they're not registered. So we will have a wealth of information that we can rely on and we can use. So there is a business case there as well. So thank you very much.
Hi, Antoine Navarro, I'm a consultant. Your review of 1,600 indicators was quite impressive, and it's bad enough that there were so few about utility and outcomes. I was wondering if you still had a view on whether all these indicators were actually populated and reliable, and if you have already an opinion of whether FSPs are actually equipped to collect these indicators that are more than basic demographics and financial data.
Should I just quickly answer that one, and then we can open again? So on the 1,600 indicators, they're looking at different types of organizations. So it's both from universities, it's from global standards. So we have SPTF, we have IRIS Plus. So it's like the standards, it's the surveys that is there. So Global Findex, FinScope, FinAccess. We have what a lot of the funders are using as indicators. So some of them are from surveys, some of them is from the operational banking, core banking data. So it's a mix of data sources, but it's just to give an overview of what is being used by whom. And right now we are trying to do a lot more analytics on them, and we are trying to increase the data set to include more on different like for example, we don't have a whole lot on insurance. So we're trying to figure out, okay, who's in insurance? What are they actually measuring? So we're trying to make it a more holistic. So this is just our preliminary efforts on trying to scope it out, but it's a lot bigger than that in reality. So we're still categorizing which ones are menus of indicators, which ones are useful in like actually being used indicators. So we will do a lot more over the next 6 months on this, and then hopefully have more to share back. Yeah, we have another question, comment, suggestion.
So while we're waiting for that one, Karina, I would just respond a moment ago. While I generally agree on the idea that bad products go away, it is also true that some of the longest lived financial services companies in the United States are predatory lenders.
Yeah.
Wells Fargo gets sued for a couple of $1 billion every 10 years for consumer protection violations, and Wells Fargo ain't going anywhere.
Business.
They've been around since the 1840s, right? Not to just isolate them as a predatory lender at all, but so I do think I think it is important to note the market test, but I think it's also to not just rely on the market test. And I think it's also important to recognize that commercial providers are always going to face pressure to move up market, right? The people presumably that you care about in this room, caring about, are always going to be less profitable at the equivalent prices to the people a step above them. And those are going to be less profitable than the people a step above them. And so there's always going to be pressure on people to shift progressively. And we've already seen that in the microfinance movement, right? How many MFIs do you know of that have, creep a little bit? It's a little less on the women. It's a little less rural. It's a little more urban. It's a little bit larger loans. Like it's already happened here, and it will continue to happen. And so part of having these outcome measures that aren't just this basis is to say, how do we justify the subsidy that is required to keep people focused on these less profitable segments of the market?
Good point, Tim. Thank you. Do you want to add to it? I think there was another question. Yeah.
Thank you. Just 2 quick questions. I'm wondering whether the winners that you observe come in contexts where financial inclusion has been driven off the back of some form of economic inclusion activity or livelihoods activity, and that the losers are actually in contexts where, you know, we're pushing financial services in areas where there's no economic activity that should be and can be supported by financial services. Then the second question is whether you agree or disagree with the notion that most of financial inclusion has been about innovations in distribution of products rather than fundamental product innovation.
Those are big questions. I'm not sure we're the right panel to take them all on. Let me just take a little slice of it because, you know, so in Finca, we know that 80% of our customers are either small scale farmers or entrepreneurs. And so there is, you know, our interaction is fundamentally one around livelihoods and income generation. I think we still have our winners and losers. So I'm not sure that that is the determinative factor. And then your second question was
Innovation and distribution versus innovation in product.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll just speak from Finca's perspective for sure. The attention over the last 10 years or so has really been about distribution and transaction channels and agency banking and mobile banking and what have you. But you know, as those are more digital, they do open the arena for more innovation in product features. So hopefully that will come back to focus once those channels are actually working the way that they should, which I don't think we can say they are at the moment.
So in the studies that I was referring to before, they are all typically within relatively urban areas because it's a lot easier to do the research there. You know, one example of this is a big project in Andhra Pradesh. And so I don't think it is an issue of certain people access to livelihoods and others don't. It is within the number of people operating small scale sewing shops or vegetable stands. Quite honestly, talent is unequally distributed. Some people have an internal drive and a way of thinking about things. And I don't think there's anything wrong with acknowledging that. And that some of those people are going to figure out ways of solving problems and doing that. The challenge always is, can you identify beforehand who those people are? I would say if you look at the United States and all of the money that goes into venture capital, the answer is no, you can't figure that out beforehand. What you do is you shower a lot of money and a few of them take off and do really well. And then you look like you're brilliant because nobody remembers all of the ones that failed and didn't ever get traction. So we shouldn't necessarily be holding microcredit to a standard that the savviest minds in venture capital around the world could never meet. In terms of the distribution versus product set, my quick quiz. Who invented microcredit? I mean, come on. Who invented microcredit?
Any takers? Everybody's saying Eunice.
Everybody's got their own
Everybody,
answer.
I hear Eunice.
Okay.
As an echo.
I think the right answer, as far as we can tell, is either Jonathan Swift, the Irish author in the 1700s, or Benjamin Franklin. Both of them created microfinance banks using group liability loaning to productive purposes. Benjamin Franklin, in fact, invented social investment. He set up microfinance banks in Philadelphia and Boston with the intent of recycling the gains from lending, making microcredit loans to people excluded from the financial system to invest in the public water systems in both of those cities because he thought that would benefit everybody, right? We have a long history of people trying to figure out how to offer the products. And some of what we've learned is a lot of them just don't work. There is a prescribed set of ways that you can actually make this work. And so I don't think it's that surprising that we wouldn't have seen a lot of innovation in the product, is because that's built on 200 years. And we also don't see a lot of innovation in a lot of sort of basic material science stuff anymore. We kind of know which materials are strong and which ones are not. And you can't build a rocket ship out of cabbages.
Yeah, we have another 2 hands up there.
And in a way, I really liked what Scott Graham was saying, but I don't recognize it. So you were saying we're really making great progress. We are using data in a better way, and we're showing it in a more accessible way. I actually think that there's sort of a divide coming about between the very small institutions and the larger ones. And there's with this data stuff and all these tools as well, you sometimes see really incomprehensible things that don't make sense at all, but it looks good. And I really am fearing that there's some organization really going ahead, and that it's a sort of leaving no one behind is also applicable at the organization level. And are we doing something to be democratic with this new knowledge and these new skills and truly building data insights, also for the very small ones?
I just love your comment. I think that's a great point. I mean, and I think there's a call to action there for organizations like CGAP and other funders to really put some resources behind capacity building in our sector, so that more of our researchers and managers and people are just become really, literate and conversant in this kind of new technology that is just going to be essential for us to do our work. So get on it.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And I would like to build on the last comment of the lady, because the title of this panel is doing a collective action, right? To understand more the development outcomes of financial inclusion. And of course, we have 2 great, panelists providing experience. But my experience, having information from RCTs, which are very complex methodologies, don't capture the complexities, in which microfinance or financial inclusion operates, is one of the challenges, right? So the second question of the panel was asking, what methods, tools, and other, approaches can be taken to address those complexities. So I will be very interested in, getting your views, about, because RCTs is something unrealistic for small organizations.
Yeah.
Small organizations that don't have the muscle like Finca, in employing all these capacity, but also other methodologies that can address these complexities and provide these collective actions. So then what CGAP, as an umbrella organization in this initiative 2.0, can also encourage to do this collective, exploration of development outcomes, and bring now that into discussion to financial inclusion. In the last years, we have been experiencing financial inclusion increasing, but we have cases like in Kenya. In the last 10 years, financial inclusion has rocketed, but we see the financial health, index has gone down. So I think there is a call to action here, and I think it will be great, in this panel also to take this.
Thank you so much. Should we start with you?
Sure.
Tim, and then go to you. Yeah.
Okay. And it's absolutely true that not every organization can use every methodology. And certainly small institutions are challenged to run experiments, both because they are under-resourced, but also to have an experiment you can really learn from, you need a big enough sample to have 2 people to experiment, 2 groups to experiment with. For organizations like that, I think the thing to do is to be thinking less about how do we run our own experiments, but how do we build up knowledge to interpret other people's experiments that allow us to do more inline experimentation. What happens if we change some aspect of our delivery, some aspect of our product terms, some aspect of how we go about advertising and recruiting customers? based on a flow of information from others. And I think that's why, what this initiative that CGAP is launching is important is, you don't have time at a small institution to look at 1,600 different outcome indicators and which ones apply to you. And somebody's got to boil that down and make some things that are useful in that way. The second part of that was about
financial health. I know you have opinion on that.
I use the vaccine versus antibiotic analogy, and I think financial health is a dead end. I think financial health is a dead end because if we look at health, trying to get people to agree on what the right measures are and what the right actions to increase health are. I mean, there are people like literally coming to blows in the streets over whether a vaccine is a good thing or a bad thing right now. And I worry about us as an industry basing our efforts on something that no one can agree on, even when it's actually the appropriate analogy for what we're talking about. What does it mean to be healthy, and what are the right pathways to do that? What are the right investments to get people healthy? If we can't agree on that on just health, then translating that into financial health, of course, we're going to have massive disagreements over what is financially healthy and what products actually help you get there. And I don't see it advancing us much beyond where we already are, which is having arguments about the right mix of credit versus savings and what is the right level of interest to charge, and how do we balance the sustainability of the institutions versus the benefit to the people. I don't see that it moves us forward in those conversations.
Yeah, if I could add, so I think, we need to think about the fit for purpose approach, right? So evidence for what, right? What are we trying to use a piece of evidence for? RCTs, they have their role to play in informing knowledge, right? The accumulation of knowledge and, the informing of policy around how to make kind of, big, broader decisions about where we should be putting efforts as society. I don't think it's the right approach for an MFI that's trying to figure out, what kind of product to deliver. And there are much better approaches that are for that purpose, such as, human-centered design, for example. And you don't have to be a behavioral economist to come, to execute a human-centered design activity. Good qualitative research, and somebody who really knows how to get to the core issues. I don't mean just going out and talking to people. Of course, that has its place as well. But I mean, really well thought out, properly executed qualitative research can be scaled down to almost any organization's needs and capacity, and it will tell you more about what to do to make the product more impactful than a dozen RCTs. So I think that, and we don't speak a lot about qualitative research in these kinds of fora because I think it's sort of a black box, and it's hard for us to know the good from the bad.
Participants in the ongoing sessions, we invite you downstairs to the Agora to take a light meal. The buses are leaving in half an hour in the Agora on the ground floor.
Yeah.
But that
End
was
of conversation.
very abrupt end of this.
We're in an abbey and the God spoke.
Sorry, so you want to say something? So I just want to say before you leave, I just want to give the word for 30 seconds to the CEO of CGAP, who was kind of also shepherding this at a higher level, and it created a champions group with a lot of investors at a very high level to really look at, like, I love your comments because it made me want to ask questions back to you. How do you define financial inclusion? How do you define financial health, financial well-being? There's so many terms, and figuring out what it all is and how it's connected with evidence is what we want to do with this initiative. But just to have her say the closing words, and then we can all go down.
Totally improvised, so bear with me. So I want to say basically that this is a journey that I think you have all started years ago. In fact, there's nothing really new in the concepts we're defining here. All of you have been talking about finance for years, right? But what we want to do is in a way support that process going forward and create a very meaningful evidence base for that concept to be based on, so that the credibility of us talking about the impact we create is not questioned anymore. We want to also make that evidence base much more granular, so that the questions on microcredit, etc., what works for whom, when, what are the circumstances that make it work or not, what does it mean for product design for an MFI, for instance, so that these answers can be answered, those questions can be answered better. And then lastly, we really would like, in a way, our industry to be guided by as uniform and objective as possible. And we had that years ago with the access goals. We had the 2020 universal access goal, and that really led hundreds of governments to define national financial inclusion strategies. But this is the past, and we are nearly at universal access. We're not, but we will be very soon, because we know the recipe to get there. And so ultimately, even if we know that if we get very close to universal access, we will still not be at destination, because you all know that having an account, as Karina was describing, is just the beginning of a journey. And that with an account, you can do a few things, but you cannot, for instance, adapt to climate change in a meaningful manner with just remittances on the e-wallet. So we want basically to support a collective view of what it is that we're trying to achieve collectively, set it up out there in the world for others who work on related topics to see, to understand, and to value ultimately. Our vision is that financial inclusion should be part of the climate dialogue, of the climate agenda, and it is not. There's a lot of discussion about climate finance, but not inclusive climate finance, or very little. And all the discussions we have this week show that this is a very incipient dialogue, but mostly within the industry, not with the climate folks. Similarly, on food security, we heard it this morning. It's very, very, very relevant at every single step of the equation. But are the food security experts thinking of us? Probably not much at all, and so on and so forth. So we think that if we provide this evidence with credibility, and we use it to define what we want to contribute to, with a lot of humbleness, because we all know that financial inclusion is only one ingredient. Many more things are needed to get all these outcomes around climate adaptation, food security, etc. But at least if we can demonstrate with robust evidence that we can contribute to this agenda, and if we use this as a community to guide our work, I think it will serve us well. It will increase our visibility. It will increase our effectiveness, which is at the end of the day what matters for all of us, and our contribution to global development, which today is kind of really urgent and needed. So I'll stop there. I hope we can count on you and participate in this journey with us. We need your comments, because this is difficult. All these questions show how complex the problem is. But hopefully we can get steps forward together. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And thank you all for coming. Thank you. I'm getting this Madonna vibe with this like it.